My name is Nico. I am a pastor among the folks down here in Girdwood, Alaska, serving with Girdwood Chapel, who is our virtual host for the evening. We are all coming from our own places, but we are virtually hosted at least through Girdwood Chapel tonight. I do want to acknowledge that I see some of you on the registration list and recognize some names among the attendees who I see trickling in over here, who I trust and I know could easily be leading the conversation tonight and sharing from your own experiences as well. But for most of us coming to this event, this is an opportunity for us to listen and to learn and to approach with humility, to hopefully have our eyes opened, our hearts widened, and to see some realities of racism that is prevalent within our Alaska and our Alaskan culture.
My name is Murray Crooks. I'm the pastor of Every Nation United Methodist Church, new church start here in Anchorage, and I'm from Sitka. I am a descendant of folks from England, Canada, and Gamble, Alaska, so I am both white and Siberian Yupik. And the topics that we're going to be discussing today are very important, personal, and deep to me. But since I'm a pastor and I have a platform to speak from the pulpit, we're really happy to have Charlie Brower and Dionne Brady here with us today to bring their unique perspective. And I'm going to do my best to keep my mouth closed. And just be a good host. Having said that, though, I'd like to acknowledge that as we start this topic and this discussion about race in Alaska, today is barely an introduction. And some of the things that we're going to talk about are sort of the history and the reality of racism as it is seen, understood, and experienced from a Alaskan Native perspective. And even with that, we don't have a representative Alaskan Native voice that would represent all Alaskan Native folks in the state, let alone any Black folks, Pacific Islanders, Filipino, or any other groups of people, Latinx folks who are living in Alaska, who have their own unique experiences and history with systemic racism in Alaska. And I'll just acknowledge that right off the bat, and know that we may need to have some more of these discussions going forward so that we can get a better understanding of what those experiences are like. Let's see. That's all I've got for now. At this point, I would like to pass the baton and ask Erin to introduce herself.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Erin Baldwin-Day. I am also a United Methodist pastor. I live in Anchorage, Alaska, but the church I serve is Palmer United Methodist Church. I was born and raised here in Anchorage. I was an expat, if you will, in Texas for about 10 years before coming back to live and work here. And as Murray mentioned, we are beginning tonight by examining the history of racism in Alaska. And that is a critical beginning point for us. In order to understand where we are today, we really need to begin with Indigenous voices, as their interaction with white people is the root of the racism that we experience even now. I'd like to begin tonight with an acknowledgement that we are on the traditional Indigenous lands. Based on your comments in the chat, we are, although we gather virtually, each of us is living and working on the traditional lands of Native Alaskan peoples. And it's important for us to remember that and to own that from the outset. That we are gathered on the ancestral and now occupied lands of the Dena'ina, of the Ahtna, the Tanana, the Alutiiq, the Tlingit, the Haida, and the Tsimshian. Just this gathering tonight, we are gathered on lands that have belonged for centuries to those people. We offer our respect to their elders, both past and present, and we acknowledge that their stewardship of this land is what makes this gathering possible. I'd like to introduce to you tonight our panelists. We have two people who are more than qualified to speak, both as people who have studied history and as people who have experienced themselves what it feels like and what it looks like to experience racism in Alaska. I would like to first ask Miss Dionne Brady-Howard to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about who she is and how she comes to this conversation.
Yeri kukayu chet duasak, kix adichet city, kachet jashayu haduasak, take way di yedi ayachet, kaka hit da chet city, kagwantan dachchen ayachet. My Tlingit name is Yeri Kuka, and my borrowed name is Dionne Brady-Howard. I have the Tlingit name of my late grandmother, Isabella Brady, and I come from the Kiksadi clan, which is one of the many clans that comes under the Raven moiety. In Tlingit culture, we have two moieties, which are Raven and Eagle, and we have a little over 30 clans that come under each of those two. And most of those clans have different ancestral homelands that they would mostly identify with. And my clan that I come from happens to be the traditional clan that occupied and also held the stewardship over Shitka, over Sitka, where I grew up. A lot of people maybe grew up in places where their clan didn't have a stronghold because they would move in order to marry someone from a different clan who they weren't related to. And so not everybody was privileged to grow up where their clan has its roots. I come from the point house of the Kiksadi because we're further divided into house groups from our clan groups. And the women of my clan are referred to as the Kachet Jasha, which there's no really easy English translation for. When we're translating it to be expedient, we'll say it means the herring ladies, but Kachetja is this beautiful word that refers to the way that the water sparkles when the herrings spawn in it in the spring, when the sun shines on it and it looks like shattering glass. And if any of you have ever seen herring spawn, there's really no other way to describe it to someone who hasn't seen it, but the water truly sparkles the way the sun hits it. And I'm the child of the Teakwedi. We're a matrilineal society, so I am what my mother was as far as my clan identity, and I identify as the child of my father's clan, and I'm the grandchild of the Kagwantan clan. I was born in Anchorage and raised here in Sitka by my late grandparents, Bill Brady and Isabella Brady. And I was privileged to grow up here in Sitka, where my late grandmother, Isabella Brady, had worked at Mount Edgecombe from 1960 until 1974. And when she left Mount Edgecombe High School in 1974, it was actually to begin the Sitka Native Education Program, which is a federally funded program that served as a cultural education program to basically try to revitalize as much as they could of our Tlingit language, songs, dances, traditions, protocols, and stories. And she herself was not culturally knowledgeable. She went to school at Sheldon Jackson School, which among most of the schools in the territory and then state was very heavily assimilationist. She was mostly raised by her grandparents, who also went to Sheldon Jackson and were very heavily assimilated. And her grandfather was Tsimshian from British Columbia, and her grandmother was Tlingit from here in Sitka. And so English was spoken in the home. She didn't know our Tlingit language or songs, dances, or traditions. She went and obtained her degree from Jamestown College in North Dakota and was probably one of the first, if not the first, she was definitely one of the first Indigenous women from Alaska to earn a college degree. And so she used that education first to support her family working at Mount Edgecombe, and then left that job at Mount Edgecombe in order to start the cultural education program. We have this song that's sung throughout Southeast Alaska that's called Suhede Shugachtutan, and it comes from a speech by this man named George Davis, who was from the Deshitan clan. And Tlingits have a way of saying things that's it's often very metaphorical, and the words say that we'll once again open this container of wisdom that was left in our care. And he refers to the fact that we were forbidden from practicing our culture through different religious and educational structures for a very long time. And in Sitka, the way that looked was that we had a final potlatch in 1904. And it was the last traditional one that was had. And then basically the culture wasn't practiced. The language wasn't really spoken except, privately in homes for 70 years until my grandmother started this program in 1974. So I was privileged to grow up learning about my Tlingit language and culture, and through song and dance and stories. From the time that she started that program when I was 1, and when I officially enrolled in it when I was 3 until I was 18. And then I went on to get my degree, ironically, from Sheldon Jackson, and became a teacher. And I taught in Southwest Region School District as an itinerant social studies teacher for 2 years in 4 different villages. And then I got my job at Mount Edgecombe in 2000, and I've been there ever since. So I'm very culturally active in my community to this day. I lead one community-based dance group called the Shitkakwan Dancers, which means people of Sitka dancers, and then one called the Nakahiti Dancers, which is the group that dances for the tourists in the summer. And I've been utilizing that position since 2012 to teach our children who are there, as well as adults who might either have gone away from the culture or not been privileged to grow up with our culture, our songs and our dances and our stories that go with those songs. So, and then in the community, I'm very active in Native events, obviously, but also Native causes. So I've spoken to the volunteers who come to our town every fall. The women's shelter hosts like sort of a cultural sensitivity training, as well as just an orientation to Sitka. And I've conducted that for about 7 years for the women's shelter, and then also conducted one for the Sitka Police Department and Sitka Fire Department and EMTs. So this is something that I sort of just do in what little spare time I have, and I feel honored to be asked to be here, and I hope that I have some insight to offer that will be helpful to people who cared enough about this topic to show up this evening. Gunalshish, thank you.
Dionne, I have no doubt that you have much to share with us, and we are all excited to learn from you tonight. Thank you for being with us. I would like to invite our second panelist, the Reverend Charlie Brower, to introduce himself and to tell us a little bit about his life, his journey, and how he comes into this space. Charlie?
Goeienaand. Atgale asiangatak Inupiaq kutqaaving me. Apaga Sirawan Akaga 2000. Asi dading ma apaga Charles Brower. Asi Akaga taframang asiangatak. My name is Charles Brower. I'm Inupiaq from Barrow. My Inupiaq name is Asiangatak, named after my grandmother. My maternal grandfather was Stephen Sirwin, one of the first converts by the missionaries in Wainwright. My grandmother from my mother's side is Ruth Tigausen. My grandfather was Charles DeWitt Brower. He was a whaler, trader. My grandmother was originally from Shishmarab. Her name was Asiangata. That's who I'm named after. I'm a product of boarding schools. I was in Wrangell Institute for a couple of years in 7th and 8th grade years, and 4 years in Mount Edgecombe, who was still under the BIA. and I knew Isabel Brady. What I have experienced, well, my background really was I'm an electrical engineer with a master's in business. I have been a business executive. I've been an aerospace engineer. But much of what I've experienced has been outside of Alaska from say 17, 18 years old on until I came back in 1992. But a lot of that experience was not the most comfortable. And I became a United Methodist pastor a number of years ago, probably 6, 7 years ago, when I became a licensed local pastor, and eventually became ordained as an elder in Methodist Church a couple of years ago. And I began that journey in the ministry when I knew that there were over 100 communities throughout Alaska that any particular Sunday there was nobody leading church services. The missionaries left 100 to 75 years ago and never came back. In many of those communities, there were some church folks, families that tried to have the church work happen, and it was not. So even as recently as 5 years ago, there were still 100 communities or so throughout Alaska that any particular Sunday did not have church leadership to help them in their worship. So that's where I come from and a little bit of who I am.
Charlie, thank you very much for sharing that with us. I'm going to turn back to Dionne. Dionne, we've heard already a couple of important historical allusions. One of those being to the boarding school system, and the other being to the missionary history of Alaska. You mentioned the religious and the educational structures that influenced your upbringing and the upbringing of your family. Charlie mentioned the same. Would you give us a bit of an historical overview of what those structures look like, how they came into being, and how they exist today?
So I think, before I launch into the history, I just want to say that by trade, I am a history teacher. And, when it comes to studying history, there are all kinds of sort of too often repeated platitudes, things like, if we don't learn about our history, we're doomed to repeat it. I think that one of the things that is hardest to do is to have a discussion about racism, no matter what kind of discussion you're trying to have, no matter which particular races you're looking at, that as a starting point, I think it's really important to understand the history. And in addition, to understand that when we talk about the history, it's not for the purpose of dredging up any kind of blame, but it is to try to come from a place of mutual understanding of how we got to the point that we're at. We're not at the worst point in history that we've ever been at in regard to race relations, but nor have we come even close to reaching the goal that whether we're looking at our national goal of trying to live up to that ideal of all men are created equal that's penned in our Declaration of Independence, or whether we're just looking at like goals of equity within our specific congregations, for example. But that we have to delve into that past in order to have an understanding of how we ended up where we are today. And in Alaska, it's a pretty interesting and unique history. My understanding of it is that basically we ended up with Sheldon Jackson into the district at the time. It was, before we were a state and before we were even a territory. And he was charged with the task of providing education in this district of Alaska with a very limited budget. And his brainchild was basically to take the money that he did have and subsidize what different churches and religions were already doing in different regions of the district as far as what they were providing and which regions the different religions had a stronghold in. And so they were already in the different regions. And so we end up with all of these different religions that ended up in the different regions of what is now our state of Alaska. And they were charged with providing an education to Native children. And just as we have different religions today that all have different viewpoints, different ways of seeing things, some who are, for example, right now, very focused on issues like equity, and some who maybe don't want to have those discussions, and then a whole bunch of people in between. It's very similar in our history in terms of the ways in which this task of providing an education was carried out. I will say that overall, most religions, though, did have sort of that, manifest destiny sort of a focus, and a focus in which the native cultures and languages were believed to be primitive. And so they felt that they were doing right by Native people in order to force assimilation on our people across Alaska. And so one of the things is, I teach at Mount Edgecombe, and I teach only one section of Alaska history. Other than that, I teach world history and government. But in any given class where the topic comes up, one thing that you can ask any class of predominantly Alaskan Natives, Mount Edgecombe's not a Native school, but it's predominantly Native. I can ask almost any class that I have, how many of them have heard stories of their grandparents, great-grandparents, or ancestors who would go to school, didn't know English, because obviously they're there to learn the English, so they didn't come to school knowing it, who all they knew was to speak their various indigenous languages throughout the different regions, and that who would be actually really cruelly punished if they would speak their indigenous language in school. And most of the hands will go up in any of these classes that I teach. And I think that when we're looking at having any kind of discussion about race relations and racism in our state, as it stands now, is it's important to start from there to understand that this has been the experience of maybe not our kids right now in these classrooms, but it is the experience of the people who came before them. And I would say that anything that was physically done to our people, as far as any kind of harm that was done when they would speak their language, that could heal. But, if you look at anything and you know anything at all about child development, it was the mental and the emotional wounds that came from that didn't heal, because you're basically showing up to an institution every day that you don't have a choice whether to go to or not go to. You're required to go to this school, and you're showing up to this institution day after day and punished for speaking your language because you don't know anything else, not allowed to partake of any of your traditions or things that they're not like now. They're things that we sort of are trying to revive and or preserve, but then it was your entire way of life. It was who you were. All of that was forbidden. So basically what happened to generations of our Native people at different points through the history throughout our state, and I say that because different areas got contact at different times, depending on when they'd find things in different parts of the state that could be exploited for making money. That's the experience, and that's what our people dealt with. And so that causes, yes, physical wounds, but then also mental and emotional wounds that led to a lot of depression. Because when you show up day after day, and wherever it is that you end up going, all you're receiving is messages that who you are as a person isn't good. That's going to bear so heavily on your psyche that, and then there's no structure for helping you heal from that. And that's all you've been barraged with. And that's the history of Native people in our state. Now, is that in the entire history? Obviously not. I mean, progress has been made. We've found some places in which we are able to exercise political muscle, etc. But that's the starting place. And different regions, different communities, different cultures have had different experiences from there. Well, as an educator and as someone who just finished 4 years on the Sitka School Board, the leap that's hard to make is getting people to understand that A, they have to know that history, and B, even if that history isn't where we are now, it's led us to where we are now as far as the different things we're dealing with. Because one of the biggest trends in education right now, and in my 20-year career, obviously, we've had lots of different trends, but one that has stuck with us for the last few years is what's called becoming trauma-informed. And that's not just for Indigenous kids, it's not just for ethnic minority kids, it's actually a problem in our whole nation. But with Indigenous kids, it takes on a completely different direction, in that what Indigenous students in our state are dealing with would be both historical trauma as well as generational trauma that might have been passed down from the different people who experienced the trauma. So even though our kids are no longer walking into a school building or a classroom and being punished for speaking their language, and in fact, a lot of our districts have done solid by our kids and tried to work Indigenous languages into offerings and requirements, a lot of them still carry that burden that's been passed down. And there are a lot of studies that are happening. And I think in order to understand where we're at now in our state, that's probably the most important starting point, is to understand that history of forced assimilation on the part of our educational and religious institutions and its continuing impacts for Native people. And then just to come at it from a place of compassion and empathy, and not dismissal of, oh, well, that was 100 years ago. Do you expect me to still take the blame for, you know, what missionaries before me came and did? Well, obviously not. I mean, I'm not here in this panel discussion to ask Aaron or Nico or Murray to accept any kind of responsibility for their predecessors. But what is important is for them as you know, people who are leading their congregations, is to know that history and to know that that this is where Native people have come from. So I hope that lays some of the groundwork that you were hoping.
Absolutely, Dionne, thank you very much for that. For those who might not be quite as familiar with the name Sheldon Jackson, he was a Presbyterian minister, and in 1880, if I remember correctly, he brokered a deal between the leaders of Protestant denominations and essentially carved Alaska into different areas that each Protestant denomination would take responsibility for essentially evangelizing. And then he was also placed in charge of the education of Native children as a result of those efforts. And so the church has been tied up in this history really from the very beginning. And what Dionne just shared is the ugly outworking of that. Charlie, is there something that you'd like to add to what Dionne just shared? I know that you have your own experiences in the boarding school system.
Well, even before that, I'd like to add, along with that assimilation, the cultures we had were hunter-gatherers. Many people like to refer to us as subsistence people, but subsisting to me means just barely making out, which many of us really are just barely making out. But way back when, there was a division of the types of work the women did, the types of work the men did, which were taken from us. The job of the man was to go out and hunt and provide food for the family. And that happened every day of the year. And the job of the woman was to prepare that food, make clothing. But then along with some of that assimilation work came the rules and hunting rules and regulations that were forced on us, where we could now hunt maybe for a moose 12 hours out of a year. and under a quota system where we have to hunt for the food that we would normally have gotten all year round, with sports hunters who bag it for the size of the trophy. And so the laws that we live under today have caused a change in the family lifestyles of most hunter-gathering Native people. And you wonder why a man is feeling emasculated and then taking to drugs and alcohol and other improper behaviors. What is their role now when they can only hunt moose, say, for 12 hours out of the year? Or fish, only when Fish and Wildlife says it's okay to open up certain rivers. The lifestyle has changed along with the assimilation into the culture that's here with us now. So it's more than just education. It's a change in lifestyle. And when I can remember, I was 10 years old when I went to Wrangell Institute, 7th and 8th grade years. My mother passed away about a month after I first came to Wrangell. I could not go home for the funeral. I did not know what she died of or where she died, what the situation was. All I knew was that she passed away. And I also can remember talking with folks who were not sent away, the folks that their grandparents hid them, or their parents hid them when the people who gathered the children from the different communities to go to the boarding schools, they would hide some of these children, but they would probably be the only children in that community most of that one year, the year that everybody else went off to boarding school. How lonely that must have been. The families, just parents and adults and no children around, and worried about how their children are being treated and how they're being, what kind of instruction they're receiving. A big change in the cultural norms, the lifestyles of our people. And if people ever wonder about why are we so different, why do we have so many problems, we still don't know where we fit. Many of us don't know where we fit. And if someone has not lived through some of the actions that we suffer under, it's easy just to say, oh, that can't be true. I've never experienced it. Like the situation with the race relations today. I've seen and heard of history books being altered where they say the African Americans came willingly to the United States. And that's not true. And the expansion of the United States to the West Coast was primarily done through treaties where we forcefully removed tribes from their homelands and put them someplace else so our people, the European Americans, could have a place to expand. But along with that expansion was, and that expansion happened through treaties. The treaties which were quite often broken by the government after they made them. One of those is the situation I've talked about out and again with our healthcare system. Recently, I had a situation with my stepmother where she had boxes and boxes of pills at her bedside table. So many that she could no longer close that little drawer that was there. And so my sister and I went through those boxes of pills, and it was all for the same symptom. But every time she went to the hospital, a different doctor would see her and would prescribe a different medicine than what she already had. And she no longer knew what she was going to take and when. So even the health is at risk. And this, my mother was a woman who didn't have but a second grade education. She's not able to read too well of what those impacts of those medications are for. And that's even going on today. And this was a woman who was in her 90s when she finally passed away. But the healthcare system is also a problem. I was reading in the local paper today about a couple of legislators who are having conversations about what's happening with Black Lives Matter here in the interior of Alaska. And one word that really stuck to me was over-policing. And if somebody has never experienced over-policing, you're not going to understand what it is, what it does to the psyche of a person. And what happened to one of the sons of one of my schoolmates from Monechkum, person from Ruby, after the George situation happened 3 weeks ago, that son was walking back to his room from Fred Meyer's with his groceries. He was walking because he didn't have a car. And a policeman pulled over, told him to lay down on the sidewalk. And what did he do? You're expected to do that. That's the law enforcement asking you to do something. No reason. But when he did finally let him go, he said, "Why'd you do that?" He said, "Well, on suspicion." Suspicion of what? Just suspicion. So those incidents of over-policing are things that we experience fairly regularly. And I think it's a situation that happens to most people of color. So it's not a comfortable lifestyle, but it's a lifestyle that we're living today. And it's through generations that we've experienced this, and we're still having to find ways to live within it. And hopefully one of these days that we will all live like everybody else without the suspicion of a policeman asking us to lay down on the sidewalk. I wonder how many European Americans have been asked to lay down on a sidewalk on suspicion.
I certainly have not.
Yeah.
I think there's a false sense in Alaska that those kinds of things don't happen here. And Charlie, I appreciate you drawing attention to the fact that that structural racism is alive and well in Alaska. And it started with colonialism.
Yes.
The structures that in which we operate today are the result of and the structural descendants of the programs that were put in place to control Native movement, to control Native hunting, to control Native lands. All of those things have brought us to where we are. Dionne, do you have anything that you'd like to say in response to what Charlie just shared?
I think that it sort of, it bridges us to this idea that probably one of the most important leaps that we have to take, but also one of the biggest obstacles we have is just really is that ability to acknowledge that someone else's experience might not be your own experience, but it's still something that has happened to them. I mean, we've all, at least, even if some of us maybe in this group come from a place of privilege and maybe haven't had some of these things happen. I mean, most of us just as people socializing out in the world have had that frustration of maybe dealing, say, for example, with a difficult coworker or boss, and then you're talking to someone that you have, a close enough relationship with to talk about what happened with this particular coworker, and then they say something about how, well, that's not how they've been to me. They've always been really nice. And they start launching into this whole diatribe about how this person is great to them. And it kind of invalidates your own feeling that you're having all of these other issues and experiences, but because this other person hasn't had that experience, that then you must be like imagining the thing that happened to you or the things that have happened to you. And that's kind of what this, whether we want to talk about just like institutionalized racism, or whether we want to talk about sort of just some of the societal prejudices that people of color deal with, it's where a lot of the frustration comes from, is when you're a person of color and you start talking about what your own experiences are, what's happened to you, and then people start saying, well, you know, that's not how it was for me. And then what they're basically doing is invalidating then that any of those things that happened to you really happened. Or it's also called minimization, where they're kind of trying to minimize it because since that particular coworker, or if you're a student, then that particular teacher was never mean to you, then only where it becomes a problem is that, you know, these are things that are being visited on people simply because of their race. And so the first issue, I guess, is just people being able to actually empathize and step outside themselves and realize, okay, just because that's not my experience with police doesn't mean that that's not happening to other people, and people of color in particular. I think the other thing is just kind of when I talked a little bit about the history of racism in Alaska as it pertains to Native people, is also remembering that it doesn't come from a place of blame. And there's a really big difference between blame and responsibility. So when we talk about these race relations, we're not asking everyone who's European in their descent to take the blame for the things that happened in the past as far as educational institutions. We're not asking them to take blame for the fact that they're not targeted by police when people of color might be targeted by police, like what Charlie was talking about, which, you know, I had actually read about the same thing because that was one of my Facebook friends. So I'd read that, you know, as soon as he started talking about it, you know, it was all super familiar because I had read about it. But what it is about responsibility. So, you know, down here in Sitka, we have started trying to figure out the ways that we can engage in decolonization of our institutions and of our structures, as well as indigenization. And one of these really great quotes from this short film that we watched for what used to be called Columbus Day, and we now celebrate here as Indigenous Peoples Day, was the notion that it's up to Indigenous people to indigenize. So indigenization, like the revitalization of our languages and our cultures, is up to us as Native people. It's not something that an ally of European descent should be stepping in on. However, decolonization is something that we all have a responsibility for. And again, it's not about the blame, because there are plenty of people who are here in the webinar who have probably not directly ever contributed to something racist that's happened. There are some people who may have, you know, not knowing that what they were doing was contributing, but there's probably not a whole lot of like overt racist malice in this particular group, because most folks aren't going to show up to something like this if that's what they have in their heart. But where we have to take that next leap is realizing that even if some of us have never been directly responsible for the racism, whether it's you know, some direct experience that someone has had, or the institutionalized racism, that we do all share a responsibility for figuring out what we can do to try to ameliorate the situation. Because we as Native people, if we're looking at Native issues with racism, cannot defeat that on our own. And that's where allyship is super important. And part of that allyship is being able to take responsibility, to take those leaps and to take those steps, and to stand alongside Indigenous people, or, you know, whether we're looking at, you know, obviously it's not my place to talk too much about what needs to be done for Black Lives Matter, but we do have some similar issues. So whether we're looking at standing alongside Native people or looking at standing alongside the Black Lives Matter activists, that we can take and shoulder some of that responsibility without taking blame, and like being able to do that is probably after admitting that just because it's not your experience doesn't mean other people aren't experiencing it. The next and the second step is that ability to take on some of the responsibility to actively figure out what you can do. And sometimes what it is that you're doing is you're just standing alongside people. You know, Martin Luther King in his most famous speech references the fact that, you know, he says some of our white brothers and sisters are standing here alongside us because they realize that their freedom is inextricably tied to our freedom. Because in our nation, we're not all equal until everyone is equal. We can't say that we're all free until all are free. And that is that leap that we need people to take, is empathy and responsibility.
Dionne, that is a powerful statement. And I really appreciate the distinction that you make between blame and responsibility. And I'd like for you to unpack a little bit. You used a couple of words that may or may not be familiar to folks who are on the webinar this evening. You used the word decolonization and indigenization, and you explained a little bit about what indigenization looks like, but could you share a little bit more about what it means to decolonize a system, a workplace? What does that mean, so that we can all use the same vocabulary?
Okay, so decolonization actually has so many different facets to it, and I will just sort of front load it by saying that probably one of the biggest obstacles we have to looking at decolonization is that after the 90s, when we were all seeking to be politically correct and kind of swung that pendulum really far, as in terms of that, there's been a huge backlash ever since then, that some people just see it as political correctness, and it's not. What it is, though, is trying to find the different structures that have been put in place that have been tools of colonization. And it can be the language we use. It can be the viewpoints that are stressed in an educational system. So here in Sitka, for example, one of the things that we've just recently started working on was actually the way that Erin began her part in this at the very beginning of the webinar was what's called a territorial acknowledgement. And that is acknowledging the territory of whichever Indigenous group first, you know, had its stewardship of that land, and thanking them for the stewardship, but mostly recognizing that anyone who is not from that group is a guest on that land. And it's not just European Americans. It's something that even Indigenous people have taken to doing on one another's land. So, for example, just this past year at Mount Edgecombe High School, we have 3 different Native dance groups that perform, and they have taken to beginning their performances with territorial acknowledgements to the Tlingit people. So the Athabascans, and I know that there are several different groups of Athabascans, but because they're our smallest group at Mount Edgecombe and they dance all together, as one culture, even though there's really 12 of them. Anyhow, the Athabascan dance group was acknowledging the fact that they were on Tlingit land and thanking us for being allowed to practice their culture on our traditional homelands. Something like that would be one example of decolonization. Things like starting to try to refer to different geographic features by Indigenous names rather than European names that were then forced on these different structures that already had names for thousands of years would be another example of decolonization. Finding these different ways to, I guess, sort of in small ways, but multiple small ways, work toward trying to reverse some of the things that have been forced on Native people would be the best way that I could sort of explain what decolonization is. So for example, us celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day here rather than Columbus Day was also one big part of decolonization. And it's something that everybody can take part in. It's the Native people, and then a lot of like non-Native allies alongside us are constantly asking what they can do. You know, just trying to figure out ways that allies in the community can support the things that are important to Native people as far as issues is also an important step in decolonization as well. Does that sort of explain it well? Okay.
That is That is a fantastic answer. Thank you for all of that, Dionne. And so just to reiterate what Dionne said a bit ago, it really is truly the work of Native communities to figure out how to indigenize. That's not work that white allies could or should be involved in, but it is all of our work to engage in decolonization. And we had a great question, and I'm going to pose this to both Dionne and Charlie. For those of us who were taught a very whitewashed history, particularly of Alaska, are there resources, or what resources could you point us to if we were interested in reading something that was a little bit more, that had an Indigenous voice to it? What would you point us to as far as books, articles, podcasts, anything along those lines, so that we can be better educated, so that we can know our history and help with some of that dismantling work?
I think that's it's a really challenging question, and I don't. Tlingit people have this thing that we usually say at the beginning of like speeches and things like that, which is "Ade Chatneu," which means it's like, please forgive me if I say anything wrong. I don't mean to offend anyone by these words, but one of the things that's really interesting is, you use the word whitewashed to look at our history. And one of the things that I have found just as a teacher of still predominantly Alaskan Native students at the school that I teach is that Native people with religion, there was no choice when it first came. And so to this day, there are actually still, young generations of Native people who themselves don't know the whole history because religion was forced upon someone far before they ever came along. But then like that same like religiousness has remained. And so there are still so many discussions that even need to be had about the history of religion in Alaska that aren't being had because people are still so devoted to religion that they don't want to talk about these negative aspects. And so there's not a lot out there as far as like formal materials that I know of. And then even the conversations that need to be had aren't had. And by that, I don't mean like trying to completely decry religion. Like I myself am not an atheist or even an agnostic, but I'm sort of a free-floating Christian. And by that, I mean, for those of you who don't know, the Presbyterian Church closed here in Sitka. There was a rift, and then there was not a big enough congregation to maintain it. And so I myself am a Christian without a church. But on the other hand, before the Presbyterian Church saw its demise here in Sitka, this was the community where Sheldon Jackson began. And so Presbyterians had a stronghold in the Native community here and then also within the region. And one of the things that Presbyterians had done, and I'm also sort of addressing something I saw in the Q&A, was like, how can we continue to be Christians without like, like sort of condoning what the previous missionaries did, is that a lot of churches have taken to apologizing to Native people. And an apology is just words, but considering everything that happened to Native people at the hands of different churches over, a couple of centuries, even though those apologies were just words, they were words that showed that those different churches that had previously visited traumas upon our ancestors recognized that those traumas were wrong, even if for some of those people they might have been well-intended in trying to help people get to heaven and be saved. That it was wrong. And those apologies went a long way. And then even like the Presbyterian Church here had done, we have a peacemaking ceremony that gets done in the Tlingit culture if someone wrongs another. And they'd even gone so far as to like have some peacemaking ceremonies in the different communities. But because we're still fairly deeply religious as people across the state, there aren't a lot of real frank materials that I know of anyhow. Since these conversations are still very seldom being had.
I think one resource I would recommend would probably be the story of Elizabeth Petrovich, done by Jeffrey Silverman, Blueberry Productions, Undoing Jim Crow in Alaska. It's a good movie. It gives a good history of how we as a state we have been impacted by rules and regulations and the ethnic cleansing and a few other things that the film discusses.
Mm.
But there is one book I'm aware of that it's not a book on how to undo racism, but it's the story of an early missionary in what is now known as Prairie Mission. And the name of the book is Aparak, which in Inupiaq language means little father. And his congregants gave him that name. And he was very proud of it. But little did he realize that there is some humor in how some of our native folks view people and how they name them. Is that this missionary wanted to be so much like God as a father that they called him little father, and they just kind of laughed about it. But he very, very proudly took that name and used it as the name, as the title for his book, Apara, Christian Missionary in Alaska, I think it is. But it was written back in the 1800s. But some of the early experiences of some of the people, like in Inupiaq today, back in the day when there was one ship a year that came from Seattle with lots and lots of food and fuel for each community. But to see the amount of food and materials a missionary family was sent by the different mission groups was mind-boggling. They did not want to eat the native food, so they had cases and cases, warehouse fulls of food sent to them from Seattle. And barrels and barrels of fuel. And they lived in a 5-bedroom house where the average size of a home in Barrow at the time was maybe 2 rooms, not bedroom, 2 rooms. And they had 5-bedroom home for the missionary family. So there, I can remember some of the students commenting, says, "This must be heaven on earth if these folks can live this way." So there are some elements of humor that we apply to some of the funny experiences, funny to us experiences that we've seen. That some of the things that people are so proud of, especially those early missionaries. But little did they know how much fun was being poked at them by their acceptance of names, native. And even I can remember, I would say about 10 years ago, I was sitting with a group of elders at the lobby of the Alaskan Native Medical Center in Anchorage. And several, I don't know how the conversation got started, but the conversation turned on to, how did you end up with a name like Brown? It turns out that back in the day when the government, before Alaska was a state, the government had all these commissioners stationed in different parts of the state, what is now Alaska. But when they were taking census, they were asking these people, what name would you like? Some commissioners like presidents, so they ended up with Cleveland's and Garfield's and whatever. And some like the different colors, so we ended up with browns, whites, and yellows. And so even the name that some of the people ended up with, there were white man names that we didn't have before. And they were having great fun conversation, making fun of each other of how did you end up with that name? So even the names we ended up with, we can laugh about it now, but it must have been quite a traumatic experience of having to live with a different name that you never had before.
Thank you for that, Charlie. I think we all understand how powerful names are. Whether it's the name of a person or the ability to name the truth of something. Mm-hmm. Naming is extraordinarily powerful, and it pains me, and I hope it bothers our listeners, our viewers this evening, to hear that within the community of faith, the place where we should be able to tell the truth, the place where we should be able to name what is good and right, that because the authentic history of Alaska's Native people is so deeply embedded in the structures of religion, we struggle to tell the truth of what the history has really been 100 years removed from Sheldon Jackson. Murray, I see your hand up.
I'd just like to ask a question that's burning in my heart that also reflects the open question and the Q&A. And for Dionne or Charlie, are there some examples that you have experienced in your lives where you've been involved with communities healing from racism? And what could you share about those experiences with us?
When I was in Nome as the pastor of the Methodist Church in Nome, I was part of an ad hoc committee under the Nome Community Center. There was a social justice task force. And the impact of that social justice task force took several years to get to what it came, but it addressed the issue of starting from historic traumas to the treatment of some of the victims of rapes and other mind-boggling crimes, primarily the Native women of Nome and the region. Sitting in restaurants and bars and having conversations, eventually turned out to be some 40 people who had had not very good experiences with the criminal law system, the police systems, that they no longer want to report the crimes against them because the police was not doing anything about it. The healthcare system was even part of that problem, because the rape kits that they're supposed to submit were kept in storage, and it turned out mainly because the laboratory in Anchorage was doing all the evaluations, had such a backlog. They were asking people in the outlying villages to hold the sample kits. So when it gets to the point where the trust in the law system disappears mainly because of their inaction or the impact of a few bad people within the system, it's a difficult thing to live with. When you have to set up backdoor ways of having conversations so that the person who is having that problem would not be targeted by the police that he should be reporting to as a troublemaker. And when you're relying on pastors to be that backdoor conversation so that that report can be made to the police or the powers that be, the city office, the city manager's office, that speaks volumes to the shortcomings of our society. And even here in Fairbanks, the situation with the Fairbanks four young Native men who were convicted of a crime they did not commit. As a condition of their release, the city said, don't sue us. We let you go if you don't, you say you won't sue us. I'm glad to say today that the state has overturned that situation. But as a condition of release of a criminal system that lied to begin with, so that they could have a conviction of somebody, and then incarcerate those people for a good number of years, and then say that we don't owe you anything. That is what our law system is today. And it's not just the police, it's the judges, the lawyers, the sentencing people, the people who trace those people after the fact when they're on parole. They don't have an easy life. And it's happening today. How can we as a church and God-fearing people help those folks so that those kinds of mistakes don't happen on somebody's inaccurate testimony? It's a very difficult situation. Yeah.
I think looking at the question in the Q&A, and then also just Murray's question sort of dovetailing into it, is that I guess like it's important to note that there are a lot of different causes. There are a lot of different things going on in communities that are happening already. Here in Shitka, in Sitka, we have a lot going on that are either Indigenous issues or Indigenous-led issues, or things that affect Indigenous people. I would say that probably the first step is just trying to learn more about the communities in which you reside, because I will say that my experience has almost always been, at least in Western institutions, is being the only person of color in the room. So even as well-intended as my colleagues have been, I know that there have been times like, the film, for example, that Charlie referenced when we were going to premiere it at our school, since our school is 90% Alaskan Native, and the question comes up of, okay, well, how should we do that? And you hear the cartoon sound of heads turning around and whooshing as they all turn around and look at their resident Native teacher. And I'm just going to say that if we can do that, so can you. So when there are events that are Native events that are not closed to the public, like our ceremonies, sometimes it's going to mean feeling a little uncomfortable, being not a person of color, coming to those events and seeing what it's all about and showing your face, and remembering that you've had the luxury of always being on the other end of that, where you've had Charlie or me in a room full of pale faces, and we're the dark faces in the room. And it's okay to take that leap and take that step to learn more about the communities that you're in when there are events. I'd say that's the first step. The second is just being aware of what kind of issues there are in which you can lend a hand. And if you're a really busy person and sometimes you can't maybe pitch in and help, sometimes just standing alongside. So we have events here that are in recognition of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and those happen in the communities across our state. They happen here, they happen in Anchorage, they happen in Fairbanks. I happened to be part of one in Fairbanks when I was just in Fairbanks, and missed the one here, and I took part in that one there. Here in Sitka, we have an issue of trying to save the herring, which have been overfished everywhere else in Southeast Alaska, and we're the only ones left with a significant herring egg harvest, and we've been trying to save that and save the herring from being overfished commercially and ending up where everywhere else in Southeast Alaska is. Well, sometimes you don't need to show up and donate something or make a speech, but just standing along with the people who are protesting outside of the courthouse while the judge is considering the decision is good enough. I will say that, people have asked what can they do as people of faith and as followers of Christ, also to show allyship. And I will say that is where there's a really big gap. my mom is hugely entrenched in some of these issues, and spearheads the herring issue. Has a lot to do with like the other events and issues that get highlighted here in Sitka. And she has sort of this posse of young atheist and agnostic, progressive, non-native people who are always there. And I would say that, you know, I think your church in particular, as far as like what the beliefs are, my understanding of United Methodist is that it's very centered around social justice, but in order to be like effective allies, I would say that it doesn't need to just be young agnostic and or atheist non-native progressives showing up to these different causes. Just seeing people of faith there of all different ages, and not feeling that barrier of, you know, maybe feeling like you might feel out of place at a missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls rally, or vigil, or showing up to a herring rally. Those kinds of things is, I think, probably one of the biggest leaps that you can take after maybe taking that time to learn more about the culture of the first people wherever it is that you are from across the state. And that would be huge, because that's part of decolonization. It's part of taking responsibility for the fact that though none of you were those missionaries, and that maybe even none of those missionaries were Methodist. I'm not sure, because I don't really remember hearing Methodist mentioned in the comedy agreement that that happened with Sheldon Jackson and divvying up the state. But that Christian people, that they don't see that as needing to be the ending legacy that Christian people in the state of Alaska have. That, you know, you can step up and be more involved and show up and learn, show up and just stand with people. Or, you know, if you find yourself retired and you do have time, you know, you could be sitting alongside those young atheist and agnostic progressive non-natives who are helping make things for the herring potlatch that we have every spring, you know, because it's not necessarily a non-religious thing. It's just those are the folks who seem to have stepped forward because they're the most politically active. But there's so many different ways that people can do that. And then showing up for things like advocacy. So we're going to be in a budget crunch across our state with the price of oil having dropped. Schools are going to be in jeopardy. Their curricula are going to be in jeopardy. Native programs in schools are going to be in jeopardy. Programs and things in our state budget that benefit Native people are going to be in jeopardy. And remembering that that is probably our most vulnerable population in our state. And as such, you know, we only make up 15% of the overall state population. And if you look at the sad statistics, we make up about 5% of the state's university population and 30% of the state's correctional facility population. And so Alaska Natives are still among the most vulnerable among us. And whether we're advocating for, you know, school cultural programming funding, or whether we're having rallies, we need people to stand with us. We need people to advocate when those things are endangered. And, you know, it's a question of just knowing that you guys have a really great social justice focus in your church, and then like taking that and turning it into action for those people who need to amplify their voices with allies alongside them is probably one of the best things that you could do and the best leaps you could make.
Thank you, Dionne. That was a very powerful list of actions to take. And we have a request for you to repeat those statistics that you just named of a Native population versus incarceration and involvement in the justice system. Would you repeat those once again?
Okay, it's 15% of the overall population of Alaska, and then somewhere between, and of course it varies from year to year, but somewhere between 3 and 5% of the university population, and then 30% of those incarcerated within the Alaska correctional system.
Thank you for that. So we are drawing to the end of our time this evening, and I want to be sure that if there are any burning questions left that you'd like to ask, that our webinar attendees have an opportunity to do so. If anyone has any further questions, please take a moment now and drop them in the Q&A. I'm going to do my best to recap just a little bit of just a few of the action items that Dionne and Charlie have offered to us tonight. So the first thing that you can do as an ally is to know our history. And to take time to learn more about your community, about the issues that affect Native peoples in the community where you live. I've heard both Charlie and Dionne say that we must practice empathy. We must be able to hear a story and understand that even if something is not our experience, that does not invalidate the experience of another. And to take responsibility, not blame, but to take responsibility for the condition of our state, and to work for change by working on some of the decolonization that Dionne mentioned, by engaging with advocacy around issues that affect Native Alaskans with regard to justice and education and healthcare and policing. And those issues are cross-cultural boundaries. Those affect other people of color as well. That affects the Black community. Those are intersectional issues of justice. And also by showing up at Native events, by not being afraid to be one of the only white faces in the room, and to, in so doing, put ourselves in the shoes of another, to understand what that experience feels like for many of our Native brothers and sisters. That's the barest of the bare recap, and I apologize if I left out anything important. Dionne and Charlie, is there anything else that you would like to add at this point? I don't see any questions left in the Q&A, so do you have any parting shots before we wrap things up this evening?
I would just thank people for, being willing to come and to learn and to participate, and for, taking the time to try to learn about something that might be outside your comfort zone, and concerned enough to want to know more and to hear more. And that I just sincerely hope that maybe, that same vim and vigor that we had seen historically from folks who were here to evangelize Alaska and Christianize Natives, that maybe we can start to see like a renewal of that same type of effort, but put into trying to decolonize and do our part to find the ways to try to undo some of the effects that were done by our Christian predecessors within this district, territory, and state. And just encourage you guys to hopefully take some of this and turn it into something more than just the webinar, but like some actual actionable things that you can do in your communities. And that you have great resources who are here in the three pastors who are represented from South Central, as well as from Fairbanks, our fourth pastor there, who are committed enough to this idea to host this and to organize it. And hopefully you guys were mulling over some ideas and some thoughts of things that you can do in your own communities. And Murray and I go a long ways back when he was still younger, probably about half the age he is now, and I was about half the age I am now. And so, if you need anything from me as a resource, I'd be more than happy to follow through as well. So I just thank you all for taking the time out of your schedule to be here, and I thank the organizers for caring enough about this to organize it, and for allowing me to be in this space and encouraging me to be honest and not feel like I have to hold back anything that I have to say. And I think it was just a really important evening, and I feel privileged to be a part of it. So, Gunnar Chish.
Charlie, is there anything that you would like to add? Thank you so much, Dionne, for being so honest with us this evening. We appreciate you deeply. Charlie, is there anything that you would like to say before we close tonight?
It's not an easy subject. And the interest that people have shown is really heartwarming. And I thank you all for being here and listening and learning. And hopefully by tomorrow you'll be advocating alongside of us. And I thank you for that.
Thank you so much for being part of our panel tonight, Charlie, and for sharing your lived experience. We appreciate you, and I'm grateful to call you my colleague. Murray, would you close us tonight?
Yes, I would. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you especially, Dionne and Charlie, for leading this discussion. It's really such a unique opportunity to be able to show up and to just hear, instead of being in a situation where there's like more of a poll to wait for your turn to speak. So it's been a real blessing to be here to listen to you all and to start this thing together. Whatever this thing is, we have to be careful not to start a movement and with the hope that we might fix the world. But you know what? I think, I don't know. Like you, Charlie, my heart has been warmed tonight. And I'd like to close us all in prayer. If you would please bow with me. Bow your heads with me. Thank you so very much, gracious and mysterious God, for this time and age where there has been a need for us to talk about, to address, and to confront racism. While that reality looks different in each of our lives, Lord, I pray that you would soften our hearts and sharpen our minds so that we might be your expression of love in the world, in a world that is filled with so many opportunities for hate. Lord, help us to be the decolonizing presence of your love in this world so that people might know that there are ways to go forward that don't reflect the traumatized history of our past. And while we don't know what that looks like, I pray, Lord, that you would help us to lean on each other, to ask questions, and to be a part of whatever good movement happens through these and the many discussions that we hopefully will have in healing our country and our state, our communities around the topic of race. And we just thank you, Lord. Amen.
Yeah.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and be looking for a follow-up email in your inbox from Girdwood Chapel that will include a brief survey, some questions that you can answer, and also contact information if you'd like to get in touch with our panelists this evening. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great evening.